The gentle hum of the heater was the only sound breaking the stillness of our suburban home on Maple Street. It was a quiet Tuesday night in early October, the kind where you could almost forget the world existed beyond your four walls. I was nestled under our plush comforter, lost in a dreamless sleep, my mind blissfully blank after a long day at my new job. Thomas and I had been married for 5 years, and while things weren't perfect, I thought we were happy. We'd met in college, both of us studying business, though he'd always been more ambitious than me. He came from a well-to-do family in Boston, while I was a small-town girl from Maine. His mother, Eleanor, had never quite approved of me, but I'd always hoped that with time, she'd come around. The clock on our bedside table read 2:17 a.m. when a sharp yell tore through the peaceful night, jolting me awake. My heart raced as I sat up, disoriented, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. There, at the foot of our bed, stood Thomas. His face was contorted with anger, his usually neatly combed hair disheveled, and his eyes blazing with a fury I'd never seen before. "Get out," he screamed, his voice quaking with disdain. He grabbed the covers and flung them off me, leaving me shivering in my thin cotton nightgown. "Thomas, what's wrong?" I asked, my voice small and confused. But he wasn't listening. He stormed to our walk-in closet, yanked my coat off its hanger, and thrust it into my hands. "You didn't clean the bathroom like my mother told you to," he spat, his words dripping with venom. "I won't have an insubordinate wife in my home. You don't deserve to be here if you can't follow orders." I sat there, stunned. Eleanor had mentioned something about the guest bathroom when she'd visited for dinner earlier that evening, but I hadn't realized it was an order. I'd been so tired after work, and we'd had a lovely dinner. How had things escalated so quickly? "Thomas, please," I pleaded, tears welling up in my eyes. "It's the middle of the night. Can't we talk about this in the morning?" But my words seemed to bounce off him, unheard and unacknowledged. He grabbed my arm, not quite roughly but with an urgency that scared me, and pulled me out of bed. "No," he said firmly. "You need to learn your place. My mother was right about you all along." As he marched me down the stairs, memories of the past few months flashed through my mind. The tension had been building, I realized. Thomas had been working longer hours, coming home stressed and irritable. His mother's visits had become more frequent, and with each one, I felt more and more like an outsider in my own home. We reached the front door, and Thomas yanked it open. The cold October air hit me like a slap in the face. "Thomas, please," I tried one last time, my voice breaking. "Don't do this." But his eyes were cold, unfeeling. "And don't come back until you realize your place," he said, his voice low and threatening. With that, he gave me a slight push, and I stumbled onto our front porch. The door slammed behind me with a finality that echoed through the quiet street. I stood there, shivering in my nightgown, clutching my coat to my chest. The streets of our suburban neighborhood were eerily silent, the houses dark and lifeless. A single streetlight flickered at the end of our driveway, casting long shadows across the neatly manicured lawn. Tears streamed down my face as the reality of the situation sank in. My husband, the man I'd loved and trusted, had just thrown me out of our home in the middle of the night. Over a bathroom. Over his mother's wishes. How had we come to this? I slipped on my coat, grateful for its warmth, and started walking. I had no destination in mind, I just knew I couldn't stand on that porch any longer, staring at the door that had so abruptly closed on my married life. As I walked, my mind raced, replaying moments from our relationship. The day we met in the campus coffee shop, bonding over our shared love of chai lattes and classic rock. Our first apartment after graduation, a tiny studio that we'd been so proud of. The proposal at my favorite restaurant, Thomas down on one knee, promising to love and cherish me forever. When had things started to change? Was it when Thomas got his promotion last year, and suddenly his mother's opinion seemed to matter more than ever? Or was it earlier, those small moments when he'd dismiss my opinions or roll his eyes at my suggestions? I found myself at the small park at the end of our street. It was where we used to have picnics on lazy Sunday afternoons, back when we still did things like that. Now, in the dark of night, it felt alien and unwelcoming. I sank onto a bench, pulled my knees up to my chest, and let the sobs I'd been holding back finally break free. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the old oak trees that lined the park. In the distance, a dog barked, and somewhere, a car alarm briefly sounded before falling silent again. The normalcy of these sounds felt surreal against the chaos of my emotions. As the initial shock began to wear off, anger started to seep in. How dare he treat me like this? I wasn't some maid to be ordered around, some subservient wife from another century. I had a job, a career I was building. I contributed to our household, both financially and emotionally. And yet, here I was, cast out like yesterday's trash because I hadn't immediately jumped to fulfill his mother's whims. Eleanor. Just thinking about her made my blood boil. She'd never liked me, always thought I wasn't good enough for her precious son. Too common, too independent, not from the right family. I'd tried so hard to win her over, to be the daughter-in-law she wanted. But nothing was ever good enough. And Thomas, how could he do this to me? How could he value his mother's petty demands over our marriage, over the vows we'd made to each other? The Thomas the first fell in love with would never have done this. He would have stood up for me, protected me. When had he become this stranger who could so callously throw me out in the middle of the night? As the hours ticked by, my anger gave way to a deep, aching sadness. The life I thought I had, the future I'd imagined for us, it all seemed to be crumbling around me. Would Thomas come looking for me? Would he realize what he'd done and apologize? Or was this truly the end? The eastern sky began to lighten, the first hints of dawn breaking through the darkness. I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. My eyes felt swollen from crying, and my body ached from the cold and the uncomfortable bench. But as I watched the sun slowly rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, a strange calm settled over me. This moment, as painful as it was, felt like a turning point. The woman who had gone to sleep in that house last night was not the same woman sitting on this park bench now. Something had shifted, irreversibly. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I couldn't go back to the way things were. As the neighborhood began to stir, early risers heading out for morning jogs or to walk their dogs, I stood up. My legs were stiff, and my back protested the movement. But I stood tall, took a deep breath of the crisp morning air, and started walking. Not back towards the house, but towards the bus stop at the end of the street. I had a job to get to, a meeting with the CEO that I couldn't miss. Thomas might have thrown me out of our home, but he couldn't take away my dignity, my career, my sense of self. As I waited for the bus, I made a silent promise to myself. Whatever happened next, I would face it on my own terms. The sun was up, a new day had begun, and with it, perhaps, a new chapter of my life. The bus ride into the city was a blur of streetlights and early morning commuters. I sat in the back, trying to make myself as small as possible, acutely aware of my disheveled appearance. My nightgown peeked out from under my hastily buttoned coat, and I could feel the curious glances of other passengers. But their stares were nothing compared to the turmoil raging inside me. As the familiar sights of downtown Boston came into view, I realized I had no real plan. My purse, my phone, my wallet, everything was still at home. Home. The word felt hollow now, tainted by the memory of Thomas's angry face and cruel words. I had nothing but the clothes on my back and the spare change I'd miraculously found in my coat pocket. The bus wheezed to a stop near the financial district where I worked. It was barely 6 a.m., and the streets were just beginning to stir with early risers. I stepped off the bus, the chill October air biting at my exposed legs. The towering glass and steel buildings that usually filled me with a sense of purpose now loomed ominously, reminding me of how small and vulnerable I felt. I wandered aimlessly, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Anger at Thomas for his cruel treatment. Confusion over how our relationship had deteriorated to this point. Fear of what the future held. And underneath it all, a growing sense of determination. I refused to let this break me. As I walked, memories of our life together played like a bittersweet movie in my mind. Our first date at the quaint Italian restaurant on Hanover Street in the North End, where Thomas had charmed me with his knowledge of wine and his infectious laugh. The weekend trips to Cape Cod, where we'd walk hand in hand along the beach, dreaming of our future together. The day we moved into our house in the suburbs, full of hope and plans for the life we'd build. But those happy memories were now overshadowed by more recent ones. Thomas's increasing irritability, his growing obsession with his career and status. The way he'd begun to defer to his mother's opinions over mine. The subtle put-downs, the rolled eyes, the dismissive tone when I spoke about my own job. I found myself in the Boston Public Garden, the same place where Thomas had proposed 2 years ago. The sun was rising higher now, casting a golden glow over the lagoon. A few joggers passed by, and the occasional duck quacked, breaking the morning stillness. I sank onto a bench, exhaustion finally overtaking me. As I sat there, watching the city come to life around me, a strange calm began to settle over me. The initial shock and hurt were giving way to something else, a quiet, burning resolve. I thought about the meeting I had scheduled with Mr. Bennett, the CEO of my company. It was an opportunity I'd worked hard for, a chance to prove myself and potentially take on more responsibility. Thomas's voice echoed in my head, "You don't deserve to be here if you can't follow orders." His words, meant to diminish me, now fueled a fire within me. I did deserve to be here. I deserved respect, love, and support. And if Thomas couldn't provide that, maybe it was time I stood on my own. A jogger passed by, giving me a concerned look. I must have been quite a sight, a woman in a nightgown and coat, sitting alone in the park at dawn. But for the first time since Thomas had thrown me out, I didn't feel ashamed. I felt free. The realization hit me with surprising force. 4 years, I'd been trying to fit myself into the mold of what Thomas and his family expected. I'd suppressed parts of myself, made myself smaller to avoid rocking the boat. But now, cast out and alone, I felt a strange sense of liberation. There was no one to please but myself. As the morning wore on, I knew I needed to figure out my next steps. The meeting with Mr. Bennett was in a few hours, and I couldn't show up looking like this. I had some cash, not much, but enough for a coffee and maybe some cheap clothes from a discount store. I made my way to a small cafe on Boylston Street, one I'd frequented during my lunch breaks. The barista, a friendly young woman named Sarah, did a double-take when she saw me. "Rough night?" she asked sympathetically as she handed me my usual chai latte. I managed a weak smile. "You could say that." She hesitated for a moment, then leaned in. "Listen, we have a small locker room in the back for employees. If you need to freshen up, I could let you use it. No questions asked." Her kindness nearly brought me to tears. "Thank you," I whispered. "That would be amazing." In the tiny locker room, I splashed water on my face and attempted to tame my unruly hair. Sarah even lent me a spare t-shirt she had, which was a vast improvement over my nightgown. Looking in the mirror, I hardly recognized myself. My eyes were puffy from crying, and there was a weariness in my face that hadn't been there yesterday. But there was something else too, a determination in my gaze that I hadn't seen in a long time. Feeling slightly more human, I set out to find some clothes. A discount store a few blocks away yielded a simple black skirt and white blouse, not quite up to my usual work standards, but presentable enough. I changed in their fitting room, stuffing my nightgown into a plastic bag. Each small step, the coffee, the borrowed shirt, the new clothes, felt like a tiny victory, a reclaiming of my dignity. As I walked towards my office building, my mind turned to the practicalities of my situation. I needed a place to stay, at least temporarily. I needed to get my things from the house. And I needed to decide what I was going to do about my marriage. The thought of facing Thomas again filled me with a mix of dread and anger. But I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. The familiar glass doors of my office building loomed before me. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and walked in. The security guard gave me a nod, clearly not recognizing me in my makeshift outfit. As I rode the elevator up to the executive floor, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. Whatever happened in this meeting, whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew one thing for certain. I was done letting others dictate my worth. Thomas, his mother, this job, none of them would define me anymore. I was my own person, capable and strong. And it was time I started acting like it. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped out into the plush carpeted hallway. Mr. Bennett's assistant looked up, surprise flickering across her face at my appearance. But I didn't give her a chance to comment. I'm here for my meeting with Mr. Bennett, I said, my voice steady and confident. She nodded, picking up her phone. Mr. Bennett, your 9 a.m. is here. As I waited to be called in, I caught a glimpse of myself in the reflective surface of a nearby picture frame. The woman looking back at me was tired, a little rough around the edges, but there was a fire in her eyes that I hadn't seen in years. This was the beginning of something new. A crack had formed in the facade of my marriage at 2 a.m., but from that crack, a stronger, more authentic version of myself was emerging. Whatever Mr. Bennett had to say, whatever the future held, I was ready to face it head-on. The assistant's voice broke through my thoughts. Mr. Bennett will see you now. I took one last deep breath, smoothed down my borrowed clothes, and walked towards the office door. As I reached for the handle, I silently thanked Thomas for throwing me out. He thought he was putting me in my place, but instead, he had set me free. And I was never going back. As I stepped into Mr. Bennett's office, I was acutely aware of my mismatched outfit and less than polished appearance. The plush carpet muffled my footsteps, and the morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the spacious room. Mr. Bennett, a man in his early 60s with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes, stood up from behind his imposing mahogany desk. "Good morning," he said, his brow furrowing slightly as he took in my appearance. "Is everything all right?" I hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to explain my situation without sounding unprofessional. "I've had an unexpected morning, Mr. Bennett. But I'm here and ready for our meeting." He nodded, gesturing for me to take a seat. "Well, your dedication is admirable. Shall we begin?" As we dove into the discussion about the company's new project, I felt a surge of confidence. Despite the chaos of the past few hours, my mind was sharp, my ideas flowing freely. Mr. Bennett listened intently, nodding and jotting down notes as I spoke. "I must say," he said after I finished outlining my proposal, "I'm impressed. You've clearly given this a lot of thought. Your perspective is exactly what we need for this project." His words filled me with a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. Here, in this office, my ideas were valued. My voice was heard. It was a stark contrast to the dismissal I'd grown accustomed to at home. Mr. Bennett leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I think you're ready for more responsibility. How would you feel about leading this project?" My heart skipped a beat. I would be honored, sir." He smiled, standing up. "Excellent. Let's introduce you to the team you'll be working with." As we walked out of his office and towards the open work area, I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. This was a huge opportunity, one that could change the trajectory of my career. But as we rounded the corner, my heart nearly stopped. There, hunched over his desk, was Thomas. I knew he worked for the same company, but in a different department. We'd always kept our work lives separate. Seeing him here, in this context, was jarring. He looked up as we approached, and I saw the color drain from his face. Mr. Bennett, oblivious to the tension, smiled broadly. "Ah, Thomas. Perfect timing. I'd like you to meet our new project lead." Thomas stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. I could see the confusion and shock written all over his face. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. I need to talk to you," he finally muttered, his voice low enough that only I could hear. Mr. Bennett raised an eyebrow but didn't comment on Thomas's odd behavior. Instead, he turned to me. "Why don't you take a few minutes to get acquainted with the team? I'll be in my office if you need anything." As he walked away, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Just hours ago, I had been standing in the cold, feeling lost and powerless. Now, I was standing in the office as a project lead, while Thomas looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. "We can talk later," I said, my voice steady. "Right now, I need to meet my team." Thomas's face twisted with a mix of emotions: anger, confusion, and something that looked almost like fear. But I didn't wait for him to respond. I turned to the rest of the team, who were watching our interaction with curious eyes. "Hello, everyone," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "I'm excited to be working with you on this project. Let's get started, shall we?" As I began to outline the project goals, I could feel Thomas's eyes boring into me. But for once, his gaze didn't intimidate me. Instead, it fueled me. Each word I spoke, each idea I shared, felt like a small victory. The team was responsive and enthusiastic, asking thoughtful questions and offering valuable insights. As we discussed the project, I found myself relaxing, slipping into a rhythm that felt natural and empowering. This was where I belonged, not cowering under Thomas's or his mother's expectations, but here, leading and collaborating. Throughout the morning, I caught glimpses of Thomas. He seemed distracted, his usual confidence replaced by an almost palpable anxiety. Several times, he tried to catch my eye or approach me, but I managed to stay engaged with the team, avoiding any private confrontation. As lunchtime approached, Mr. Bennett reappeared. "How's everything going?" he asked, his eyes twinkling with approval as he saw the energy in the room. "Wonderfully," I replied, feeling a genuine smile spread across my face. "We've made some great progress already." He nodded, then lowered his voice. "I hope you don't mind, but I've arranged for a car to take you home at the end of the day. You seem like you could use a bit of rest." His kindness caught me off guard, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Bennett. That's very thoughtful of you." As the team dispersed for lunch, Thomas finally managed to corner me. "We need to talk," he hissed, his voice a mix of anger and desperation. I looked at him calmly, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the slight tremor in his hands. "Yes, we do," I agreed. "But not here, and not now. I have a job to do, Thomas." His eyes widened at my tone. This wasn't the meek, acquiescent wife he was used to. This was someone new, someone he didn't quite know how to handle. "Please," he said, his voice softening. "Just come home tonight. We can sort this out." I felt a flicker of the old pain, the old desire to please him. But it was quickly overshadowed by a new, stronger feeling, self-respect. "I'm not coming home tonight, Thomas," I said firmly. "I'm not sure I'm coming home at all. You made your feelings quite clear last night. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a team to lead." As I walked away, leaving him standing there looking lost, I felt a surge of something I hadn't experienced in years: pride. Pride in myself, in my abilities, in my strength. The rest of the day passed in a whirlwind of meetings, brainstorming sessions, and planning. By the time 5 p.m. rolled around, I was exhausted but exhilarated. As promised, a company car was waiting for me outside. "Where to, the driver asked as I slid into the back seat. I paused, realizing I didn't have an answer. I couldn't go home, not to the house I shared with Thomas. But I also couldn't spend another night on the streets. "The Marriott downtown, please," I said, making a split-second decision. I had my company credit card, surely I could justify one night in a hotel given the circumstances. As the car pulled away from the curb, I saw Thomas exit the building, his eyes searching the street. Our gazes met for a brief moment before the car turned the corner, and then he was gone. Leaning back in the seat, I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. The events of the past 24 hours swirled in my mind: the fight, the cold night on the streets, the unexpected opportunity at work. It felt like a lifetime had passed since Thomas had thrown me out of our home. But as the car navigated through the bustling streets of Boston, I realized something profound. Thomas's cruel act, meant to put me in my place, had instead set me free. In trying to diminish me, he had inadvertently given me the push I needed to reclaim my power. I opened my eyes, watching the familiar cityscape pass by. For the first time in years, I felt truly alive. Uncertain, yes. Scared, definitely. But also excited. The future stretched out before me, full of possibilities I hadn't allowed myself to imagine in far too long. As the car pulled up to the hotel, I straightened my borrowed clothes and lifted my chin. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew one thing for certain: I was done being anyone's doormat. It was time to start living life on my own terms. I stepped out of the car, ready to face whatever came next. The woman who had woken up this morning in a comfortable suburban home no longer existed. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who had found power in the most unlikely of places, within herself. The next morning, I woke up in the plush hotel bed, momentarily disoriented. The events of the past day came rushing back, and I felt a strange mix of anxiety and excitement. I had a new role at work, a new sense of self-worth, but also a marriage in shambles and no real place to call home. As I got ready for work, using the complimentary toiletries and wearing the same clothes as yesterday, my phone buzzed incessantly. Thomas had been calling and texting all night. I hadn't responded to any of his messages, but I knew I couldn't avoid him forever. I made my way to the office, stopping at a nearby department store to quickly buy a change of clothes. As I walked into the building, I felt a newfound confidence. Yesterday, I had been a mess, barely holding it together. Today, I was ready to face whatever came my way. The moment I stepped off the elevator, I saw Thomas waiting by my new desk. He looked terrible, his usually impeccable suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. When he saw me, he straightened up, a look of desperation crossing his face. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Please." I glanced around the office. A few curious eyes were watching our interaction. "Not here," I said firmly. "We can talk during lunch break. I have work to do." Thomas nodded, looking relieved that I had agreed to speak with him at all. As he walked away, I saw Mr. Bennett watching from his office door. He gave me a reassuring nod before disappearing back into his room. The morning flew by in a flurry of activity. I threw myself into my new role, leading meetings, delegating tasks, and outlining our project strategy. It felt good to focus on something other than my personal life, to feel competent and valued. As lunchtime approached, I felt a knot form in my stomach. I wasn't sure I was ready to face Thomas, to hear whatever excuses or apologies he had prepared. But I knew I couldn't put it off forever. We met in a small cafe across the street from our office building. Thomas was already there when I arrived, fidgeting with a napkin, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "Thank you for meeting me," he said as I sat down. I don't know where to begin." I looked at him calmly, trying to reconcile this anxious, uncertain man with the angry, domineering husband who had thrown me out just 2 nights ago. "Why don't you start with an apology?" I suggested, my voice steady. Thomas winced. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I'm so sorry. I was stressed and tired, and I snapped. I never meant to hurt you like that." I nodded, acknowledging his words but not accepting them just yet. "Go on," I said. He took a deep breath. "When you didn't come home yesterday, I was worried sick. I called hospitals, I drove around looking for you. And then to see you at work, leading that project. I realized how badly I'd messed up. It wasn't just that night, Thomas," I said, feeling a surge of emotions. "It's been building for months. The way you dismiss me, the way you always side with your mother, the way you try to control every aspect of our lives. That night was just the final straw." Thomas looked genuinely shocked. I didn't realize you felt that way. Why didn't you say something?" I couldn't help but laugh, a short, bitter sound. "I did, Thomas. Many times. You just never listened." He reached across the table, trying to take my hand, but I pulled away. "Please," he begged, his voice cracking. "Come home. We can work this out. I'll do better, I promise. I'll stand up to my mother, I'll be more supportive of your career. Just, don't give up on us." For a moment, I felt a flicker of the old warmth, the desire to comfort him, to make everything okay. But then I remembered how I'd felt that night, shivering on the street, feeling worthless and alone. "I can't come home, Thomas," I said softly. "Not right now. Maybe not ever. I need time to figure out who I am without you, without your mother's influence. I need to know that I can stand on my own 2 feet. His face crumpled. "But where will you go? What about our life together? Our plans?" I shook my head. "I don't know yet. But I do know that I can't go back to the way things were. I deserve better than that. We both do." As I stood up to leave, Thomas grabbed my hand. "Please," he whispered. "I love you. I can't lose you." I gently extracted my hand from his grip. "If you love me, Thomas, you'll give me the space I need. You'll respect my decisions and my boundaries." Walking back to the office, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. Part of me wanted to turn around, to go back to Thomas and the familiar comfort of our life together. But a stronger part knew that I had to keep moving forward. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I threw myself into my work, grateful for the distraction. As I was packing up to leave, Mr. Bennet stopped by my desk. "Everything all right?" he asked, his eyes kind but concerned. I nodded, managing a small smile. "It will be," I said. "Thank you for asking." He hesitated for a moment, then said, "I don't mean to pry, but if you need any help, a place to stay, legal advice, anything, please don't hesitate to ask. The company has resources available for employees in difficult situations." His offer brought tears to my eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Bennet. That means a lot." As I left the office, I saw Thomas waiting by the elevators. His eyes were pleading, but he didn't approach me. I gave him a small nod as I passed, acknowledging his presence but maintaining my distance. That night, back in my hotel room, I allowed myself to really feel everything I'd been holding back. I cried for the marriage I thought I had, for the future I'd imagined. I cried for the girl I used to be, so eager to please, so willing to make herself small. And I cried for Thomas, for the man I'd thought he was, for the love we'd once shared. But as my tears dried, I felt a new resolve settling over me. This wasn't the end of my story, it was just the beginning. I had a new job, new responsibilities, a new sense of self-worth. For the first time in years, I felt like I was steering my own ship. My phone buzzed with another text from Thomas. "I miss you," it read. "Please come home." I looked at the message for a long moment before turning off my phone. Thomas would have to learn that he couldn't fix this with a few apologies and promises. If there was any hope for us, for our marriage, it would take time, effort, and real change from both of us. As I settled into bed, I thought about the days ahead. I knew Thomas wouldn't give up easily. The begging would continue, the pleas would get more desperate. But for the first time, I felt strong enough to resist, to stand my ground and demand the respect and love I deserved. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, at work and in my personal life. But I was ready to face them. The woman who had trembled in the cold 2 nights ago was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who had found her voice and her power. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain: I would never again allow anyone to make me feel small or unworthy. The begging might continue, but I was no longer the one doing the begging. And that, I realized, made all the difference in the world. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. I threw myself into my new role at work, grateful for the distraction it provided from my personal life. The project was challenging and exciting, pushing me to use skills I'd almost forgotten I had. Each successful meeting, each problem solved, felt like a small victory, rebuilding my confidence piece by piece. Thomas, for his part, seemed to be walking on eggshells around the office. He kept his distance during work hours, but I could feel his eyes on me whenever we were in the same room. The desperation in his gaze was palpable, but so was something else, a growing realization, perhaps, of what he stood to lose. It was Friday afternoon when things finally came to a head. I had just wrapped up a particularly grueling meeting with the project team. As I gathered my things, feeling a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction, Mr. Bennet approached my desk. "Excellent work this week," he said, his eyes twinkling with approval. "Why don't you head out early? You've more than earned it." Grateful for the reprieve, I nodded and thanked him. As I made my way to the elevator, I caught sight of Thomas watching me from his cubicle. Our eyes met for a brief moment before I looked away, my heart racing with a mix of emotions I couldn't quite name. The parking lot was mostly empty when I stepped out of the building. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the asphalt, and a cool breeze carried the scent of approaching autumn. I took a deep breath, savoring the moment of peace before heading to my car. That's when I saw him. Thomas was leaning against my car, his posture a strange mix of tension and defeat. He straightened up as I approached, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made me pause. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Please." I hesitated, my hand tightening on my bag. Part of me wanted to brush past him, to maintain the distance I'd worked so hard to establish. But another part knew that this conversation was inevitable. If we were going to move forward, together or apart, we needed to clear the air. "All right," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Let's talk." Thomas let out a shaky breath, as if he'd been holding it since I arrived. "I'm sorry," he began, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I'm so sorry for what I did. For how I've been treating you. I never meant." I held up a hand, cutting him off. "Thomas, I've heard your apologies. What I haven't heard is an explanation. Why? Why did you throw me out that night? Why have you been siding with your mother over me? Why have you been dismissing my career, my opinions, my feelings?" He flinched at my words, his eyes darting away before meeting mine again. I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I guess I've been so focused on living up to my family's expectations, on being the perfect son and husband and employee, that I lost sight of what really matters." I nodded, encouraging him to continue. This was the most honest he'd been in months. "My mother," he continued, his voice gaining strength, "she's always had this image of what our life should look like. And I've been trying so hard to make that a reality. But in doing so, I've been ignoring what you want, what you need. I've been ignoring us. And that night," I prompted, feeling a lump form in my throat as I remembered the cold and the fear. Thomas's face crumpled with shame. I snapped. The pressure from work, from my mother, from trying to be perfect, it all came crashing down. And instead of dealing with it like an adult, I took it out on you. It was unforgivable, and I know that. We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of his words hanging between us. I could see the regret in his eyes, the desperation to make things right. But I could also see the man who had thrown me out without a second thought, the man who had consistently chosen his mother's approval over my happiness. "I want to fix this," Thomas said, reaching out as if to take my hand before thinking better of it. "Tell me what I need to do. I'll do anything." I took a deep breath, feeling the strength I'd built over the past few days coursing through me. "It's not that simple, Thomas. This isn't something you can fix with a grand gesture or a few promises. This is about fundamental respect, about partnership, about valuing each other." He nodded, looking both chastened and determined. "I understand. I'm willing to put in the work. Therapy, couples counseling, whatever it takes. I'll stand up to my mother, I'll support your career. Just, please don't give up on us." For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine it. Thomas standing up to his mother, truly supporting my ambitions, us working together to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect and love. It was a beautiful picture. But then reality set in. "Thomas," I said gently, "I appreciate what you're saying. And maybe, in time, we can work towards that. But right now, I need space. I need time to figure out who I am outside of our marriage, outside of your family's expectations." His face fell, but he nodded slowly. "I understand," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't like it, but I understand. Just know that I love you. That I'm here when you're ready." As he turned to leave, I felt a sudden urge to reach out, to offer some comfort. But I held back. This separation wasn't just for me, it was for Thomas too. We both needed to grow, to change, if there was any hope for our future together. I watched him walk away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. It wasn't until he disappeared around the corner that I allowed myself to lean against my car, my legs suddenly weak. The conversation had drained me, stirring up emotions I'd been trying to keep at bay. As I drove back to my hotel, my mind raced with thoughts and possibilities. Thomas's words had touched me, his sincerity evident. But I knew that words alone weren't enough. We both had work to do on ourselves and, potentially, on our relationship. That night, as I lay in my hotel bed, I felt a strange mix of sadness and hope. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it felt full of possibilities. I had rediscovered my strength, my worth. Whatever happened with Thomas, I knew I would be okay. I picked up my phone, hesitating for a moment before typing out a message to Thomas. "I heard you today. Really heard you. I can't make any promises, but I'm willing to take things one day at a time. We both need to work on ourselves. Let's start there. As I hit send, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. This wasn't an ending or a beginning, it was a transition. A chance for both of us to grow, to heal, and maybe, just maybe, to build something stronger than what we had before. The confrontation in the parking lot hadn't solved everything. But it had opened a door to honesty, to growth, to possibility. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt a glimmer of hope for the future, whatever it might hold. The weeks following the confrontation in the parking lot were a whirlwind of change and self-discovery. I threw myself into my work with renewed vigor, channeling all my energy into the project I was leading. The office became my sanctuary, a place where I could focus on my strengths and contributions without the weight of my personal life pressing down on me. Mr. Bennett continued to be a source of unexpected support. He seemed to sense that I was going through a difficult time and went out of his way to offer guidance and encouragement. "You have a real talent for this," he told me one afternoon after I'd successfully navigated a tricky negotiation with a client. "Don't let anyone hold you back." His words resonated deeply, reminding me of all the times I'd dimmed my own light to avoid outshining Thomas or upsetting his mother. No more, I decided. It was time to shine. Outside of work, I focused on rediscovering myself. I moved out of the hotel and into a small but charming apartment in the city. The process of furnishing it became a metaphor for rebuilding my life, each carefully chosen piece a reflection of my tastes and desires, unclouded by anyone else's expectations. I reconnected with old friends I'd lost touch with over the years, friends who'd drifted away as I'd become more isolated in my marriage. Their warmth and acceptance reminded me of the person I used to be. Vibrant, independent, full of dreams and ambitions. Sarah, my old college roommate, visited one weekend. As we sat on my new couch, sipping wine and catching up, she said, "You seem different. Stronger somehow." I smiled, feeling a rush of emotion. "I feel different," I admitted. "Like I'm finally becoming the person I was always meant to be." Thomas and I maintained a cautious distance during this time. True to his word, he gave me the space I'd asked for. Our interactions at work were polite but reserved, both of us acutely aware of the gulf between us. It was about a month after our confrontation that I received an unexpected email from him. "I've started seeing a therapist," he wrote. "I'm trying to understand why I behaved the way I did, why I let my mother have so much control over our lives. I know it doesn't change what happened, but I wanted you to know I'm working on myself." Reading his words, I felt a complex mix of emotions, pride in his efforts, sadness for the pain we'd both endured, and a cautious hope for what the future might hold. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself settling into a new rhythm of life. My project at work was flourishing, earning me recognition not just from Mr. Bennett but from the upper echelons of the company. I was invited to present at conferences, my innovative approaches garnering attention in the industry. One evening, as I was leaving a particularly successful presentation, I ran into Thomas in the lobby. He looked different, more relaxed, less burdened. "I saw your presentation," he said, a hint of pride in his voice. "You were amazing." For the first time in months, I didn't feel a pang of hurt or resentment at his words. Instead, I felt a warm glow of accomplishment. "Thank you," I said sincerely. "That means a lot." We ended up getting coffee, our conversation flowing more easily than it had in years. Thomas told me about his therapy sessions, about the realizations he'd had about his relationship with his mother, about the ways he was trying to change. "I've told my mother to back off," he said, a mix of determination and vulnerability in his eyes. "It wasn't easy, but I realized I can't keep living my life to please her. I need to figure out what I want, who I want to be." As I listened to him speak, I felt a shift in my perception. The man sitting across from me wasn't the domineering husband who had thrown me out that night, nor was he the desperate, pleading figure from the parking lot. This was someone new, or perhaps someone who had always been there, buried beneath layers of expectations and fear. Over the next few months, Thomas and I began to rebuild our relationship, not as husband and wife, but as two individuals on parallel journeys of self-discovery. We'd meet for lunch occasionally, sharing our progress and challenges. It wasn't always easy, there were moments of tension, old hurts that resurfaced. But there was also a growing understanding, a mutual respect that hadn't existed before. As the one-year anniversary of that fateful night approached, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed. I was thriving in my career, having recently been promoted to a senior leadership position. My apartment felt like a true home, filled with warmth and memories of the new life I'd built. I had a circle of friends who supported and challenged me, encouraging my growth and celebrating my successes. And Thomas? He had changed too. He'd stood up to his mother, setting boundaries that should have been established years ago. He'd thrown himself into his own career, finding passion and purpose in his work that had been lacking before. We were both growing, both healing, but on our own paths. It was on that anniversary that Thomas asked if we could meet. We chose a quiet park, the autumn leaves crunching beneath our feet as we walked. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "About us, about our marriage, about everything that happened." I nodded, encouraging him to continue. "I love you," he said simply. "I always have. But I realize now that love isn't enough. We need trust, respect, support. We need to be partners, equals. And I don't think I knew how to do that before." I felt tears prick at my eyes, touched by his honesty. "I love you too," I admitted. "But you're right. Love isn't enough. We both needed to find ourselves first." We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of our shared history and uncertain future hanging between us. Then Thomas reached out, gently taking my hand. "I'm not asking for us to go back to how things were," he said. "I don't think either of us wants that. But I'm wondering if you'd be open to starting over. To building something new, something better, together." I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the man I'd fallen in love with all those years ago, but I also saw someone new, someone who had faced his flaws and was actively working to be better. And I realized that I was someone new too. "I think," I said slowly, "that I'd like that. But we take it slow. We keep working on ourselves. And we make sure we're building a relationship that supports both of us, that allows us both to grow and thrive." Thomas nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "That's all I ask," he said. "A chance." As we walked hand in hand through the park, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been pain, tears, moments of doubt and fear. But through it all, I'd found something invaluable, myself. I had rediscovered my strength, my worth, my ability to stand on my own. I'd built a career I was proud of, a life that fulfilled me. And now, I was choosing to share that life with Thomas, not out of obligation or fear, but out of love and a genuine desire for partnership. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, that uncertainty didn't scare me. I knew that whatever came next, I had the strength to face it. I had found my freedom, not in being alone, but in being truly, authentically myself. As the sun set over the park, painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange and pink, I squeezed Thomas's hand. We had a long road ahead of us, but I was ready for the journey. After all, the greatest adventure was just beginning, the adventure of building a life on my own terms, with a partner who respected and supported me for who I truly was. The crack that had formed in our marriage at 2 a.m. that fateful night hadn't destroyed us. Instead, it had created space for something new to grow, something stronger, healthier, and infinitely more beautiful. And for that, despite all the pain and struggles, I was grateful.